My brother stole the CEO role I earned, but I took the entire company with me. Here's how I built a $200 million empire from the ashes, and 10 years ago, my life wasn't what anyone would call easy. At 25, I had just graduated from business school, full of ideas and ambition, ready to make my mark. What I didn't expect was to be thrust into a situation where my family's entire legacy was teetering on the edge of collapse. Let me back up a bit. My father, Jonathan Carter, built Carter Holdings from the ground up. Starting as a small logistics firm in the heart of Chicago, it had grown into a modest but respected company. For decades, it provided well-paying jobs, supported our family, and gave my father a sense of pride. But by the time I was old enough to understand what was happening, I could see the cracks in the foundation. Dad was an incredible visionary, but he wasn't great with money. And with the rapid pace of change in the industry, Carter Holdings was being left behind. My older brother Ryan, of course, couldn't have cared less. At 30, Ryan was the golden boy of the family. He had charm, charisma, and the uncanny ability to always land on his feet. Growing up, he was always Dad's favorite. He had the confidence of someone who knew he'd never face any real consequences. While I buried myself in textbooks and internships, Ryan buried himself in expensive parties, fast cars, and impulsive vacations. One evening, I found Dad sitting alone in his office, surrounded by chaos. Stacks of unpaid invoices cluttered his desk, contracts were scattered on the floor, and the man himself looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. I knocked softly on the door, but he barely noticed me. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with exhaustion. "It's over, Ethan," he said, his voice low. "I've tried everything I can, but we're out of options. I don't know how to fix this." Hearing those words hit me harder than I expected. Dad was the man who taught me to never give up, to fight for what you believe in, and to take responsibility when the chips are down. And now, he was ready to give up on everything he'd worked for. Something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the weight of his words, or maybe it was the realization that if I didn't do something, the company, and everything my father had built, would crumble. "Let me handle it," I said, surprising even myself with the firmness in my voice. "I'll take care of it, Dad." He stared at me for a long moment before shaking his head. "Ethan, you're young. This isn't something you can fix with a few good ideas." "I don't need you to believe in me right now," I replied. "I just need you to give me the chance." After a long silence, he finally nodded. "All right," he said, almost as if he didn't fully believe it himself. "Do what you can." From that moment on, my life changed. I practically moved into the office. I dove headfirst into every detail of the business, trying to figure out where things had gone wrong. It was worse than I thought. Mismanaged accounts, outdated contracts, bloated expenses. It was like staring at a sinking ship with a dozen holes in the hull. The hardest part wasn't the long hours or the endless obstacles. It was dealing with Ryan. While I was working 16-hour days trying to pull the company out of the gutter, Ryan was doing what he always did. Nothing. He'd show up occasionally, usually with a smirk on his face, and remind me that no matter how hard I worked, I'd never be Dad's favorite. One afternoon, he walked into my office unannounced, leaning against the doorframe like he owned the place. "Look at you," he said with a mocking grin. "Playing CEO. Don't get too comfortable, little brother. Dad's not going to let you take over. This is my company as much as it's yours." I didn't bother responding. I had bigger problems to deal with than his jealousy. But his words stung because deep down, I knew he was right. Ryan didn't have to work for Dad's approval. He already had it. The first year was brutal. I was running on little sleep, eating cheap takeout at my desk, and pouring everything I had into turning the company around. I renegotiated contracts, cut unnecessary expenses, and reached out to every client who had lost faith in us. Most of them didn't want to hear from me. I was young, inexperienced, and carrying the baggage of a failing business. But I kept showing up, no matter how many times doors were slammed in my face. People noticed that kind of thing. Slowly, clients started giving us another chance. Employees who had been ready to jump ship began to believe that their jobs were safe. By the end of the year, we weren't exactly thriving, but we weren't sinking anymore either. Still, it wasn't enough. Dad was proud of the progress I'd made, but in his eyes, Ryan could do no wrong. Even though Ryan was rarely around, Dad always found a way to praise him. At family dinners, while I talked about profit margins and expansion strategies, Dad would reminisce about how Ryan had always been a natural leader, someone with vision. It wasn't fair, but I learned early on that life rarely is. I wasn't doing this for Dad's approval. I wasn't doing it to outshine Ryan. I was doing it because I believed in what Carter Holdings could be. Over the next few years, the company began to grow in ways no one had expected. We expanded into new markets, adopted cutting-edge technology, and developed innovative solutions that set us apart from the competition. Revenue climbed steadily, from scraping by to 8 figures and eventually crossing into 9. It should have felt like a victory. But the bigger the company grew, the more Ryan began to reappear, as if he'd always been a part of the success. He'd waltz into the office, shaking hands and cracking jokes, acting like he was the mastermind behind it all. And Dad, of course, welcomed him with open arms. Looking back, I should have seen the warning signs. Ryan's snide remarks about me being too serious, the way Dad started talking about passing the torch, the quiet whispers from some of the board members, who had always been more loyal to Ryan than they were to me. But I was too focused on the work to notice, too busy building the empire to realize that the storm was already brewing. I didn't step into the role of saving the company because I wanted recognition or applause. I did it because I couldn't stand to watch my father's legacy fall apart. Carter Holdings was in shambles when I took over. Not officially, of course, but everyone knew I was the one making the decisions. The first 6 months were a blur of late nights, early mornings, and constant problem-solving. I forced myself to learn every aspect of the company's operations. If it touched Carter Holdings, I wanted to know about it. I wasn't just poring over spreadsheets and contracts. I was walking the warehouse floors, meeting with suppliers, and talking directly to employees who had been with the company since before I was born. It didn't take long to figure out where things had gone wrong. The company was bleeding money from every direction. Bad contracts, bloated budgets, and ridiculous spending. There was no discipline. Carter Holdings had been running on autopilot for years, coasting on its reputation while the industry passed us by. One of the first things I had to tackle was the wasteful spending, and that included my brother Ryan's extravagant habits. He had been using the company's accounts like his personal piggy bank for years, lavish dinners, first-class flights, and 5-star hotel stays. It wasn't just bad optics. It was killing us. When I put a stop to it, Ryan showed up at the office the next day in his usual arrogant fashion. He waltzed into my office without knocking, dressed like he was heading to some exclusive nightclub instead of a workplace. "What's this I hear about you canceling my company card?" he said, his tone half joking but with an edge of irritation. I didn't even look up from my laptop. "We're cutting unnecessary expenses. That includes your personal spending." Ryan laughed, the kind of laugh that said he couldn't believe I was serious. "Come on, Ethan. It's just a few dinners here and there. What's the big deal?" I finally looked up, locking eyes with him. "The big deal is that we're barely keeping the lights on. You want to help the company? Stop bleeding it dry." He smirked and leaned back against the doorframe. "Look at you, all grown up, pretending to be the boss. Just remember, little brother, Dad's the one who makes the real decisions around here. Don't get too comfortable." I didn't respond. Ryan's words stung, but I wasn't about to let him see that. He had always been Dad's favorite, and no matter what I accomplished, that wasn't going to change. But I wasn't doing this for Dad's approval. I was doing it for the company. Over time, my hard work started to pay off. I renegotiated contracts with suppliers, cutting costs without sacrificing quality. I streamlined operations, eliminated redundancies, and focused on building relationships with clients who had all but written us off. It wasn't easy. A lot of those clients didn't trust me at first. I was young, inexperienced, and carrying the baggage of a failing business. I can't count how many times I was turned down or had doors slammed in my face, but I kept showing up. People noticed that kind of persistence. Eventually, clients who wouldn't give me the time of day started returning my calls. By the end of the first year, we weren't out of the woods, but we weren't drowning anymore either. We were finally turning a profit, small, but steady. Employees who had been ready to jump ship began to believe in the company again. There was a sense of cautious optimism in the air, but not everyone was happy. Ryan's resentment was growing, and he wasn't shy about letting me know it. He dropped by the office occasionally, usually to make some snide comment or remind me that I was just a placeholder. "Don't get too attached to that desk," he'd say with a grin. "Dad's not going to let you run the show forever." I ignored him. I didn't have time to play his games. Dad, on the other hand, was harder to ignore. He was proud of the progress we'd made, but his praise always came with a qualifier. No matter what I achieved, he always found a way to bring Ryan into the conversation. Your brother has a great eye for business, he'd say at family dinners, even though Ryan was never around to prove it. He just needs to focus a little more. It didn't matter that I was the one putting in the hours, making the hard decisions, and rebuilding the company. In Dad's eyes, Ryan could do no wrong. But I learned to tune it out. I decided early on that I didn't need the credit. What mattered to me was creating something sustainable, something that could stand on its own long after I was gone. Over the next few years, the company began to thrive. We expanded into new markets, introduced innovative technology, and developed services that set us apart from the competition. Revenue climbed steadily, from barely scraping by to reaching 8 figures. Then we broke into 9 figures. It was surreal to see something that had been on the verge of collapse transform into an industry leader. But the success came with its own set of challenges. As the company grew, so did Ryan's presence. He started showing up at the office more often, acting like he was an integral part of the operation. He'd stroll in late, shake a few hands, and crack a few jokes. Everyone knew he wasn't doing any real work, but they let it slide because he had Dad's backing. At first, I didn't think much of it. Ryan had always been more interested in appearances than substance. But over time, I started to notice a shift. Dad began talking about the next generation of leadership and dropping hints about passing the torch. Board members who had been supportive of me started acting distant. Looking back, the warning signs were all there. Ryan's sudden interest in the company. Dad's cryptic remarks. The way some of the board members avoided eye contact with me in meetings. But I ignored it. I was too focused on the work, too caught up in the day-to-day challenges of running a growing company. I thought I was untouchable, that my track record would speak for itself. I was wrong. The storm was brewing, and I didn't even see it coming. The shareholder meeting felt like any other at first. It was held in the company's boardroom, a spacious and formal space with long polished tables and walls lined with portraits of my father and other past leaders. I walked in early, as I always did, with my notes ready and a clear idea of how I wanted to present the company's continued success. We had just crossed a huge milestone, $120 million in revenue. The growth trajectory was solid, the client base had expanded, and the internal operations had never been smoother. I'd worked for years to get us here, and I thought this meeting would be a celebration. I should have known something was off when Dad called it a special meeting. He'd held plenty of these before, but this one had an air of finality. Significant announcement about the company's future, he had said. My first thought was that he was finally retiring. He had been talking about stepping back for years, and honestly, I thought this meeting would be the formality to make my role as CEO official. When Ryan strolled in 20 minutes late, it was irritating but not surprising. He was always late to everything, from family dinners to critical meetings. He walked in like he owned the place, wearing that smug grin of his, shaking hands with board members like they were his old college buddies. He threw me a wink as he sat down across from me. My stomach churned, but I brushed it off. Ryan never posed a real threat to me, at least, that's what I thought at the time. Dad entered the room a few minutes later, looking tired but resolved. He stood at the head of the table and began his usual spiel about the company's history, how much it meant to him, and how proud he was of what we'd accomplished. It was standard Jonathan Carter fare, dramatic, a little over the top, but heartfelt. Then he dropped the bomb. After much thought and consideration, he said, adjusting his glasses, I've decided it's time for me to pass the torch. Effective immediately, Ryan will be the new CEO of Carter Holdings. For a moment, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Time froze. I stared at Dad, trying to process what he had just said. Ryan? CEO? It had to be a mistake. I looked across the table at Ryan, and he was already smiling, his expression smug and self-satisfied. That's when it hit me. He had known all along. Before I could say a word, Dad continued, Ryan embodies the leadership qualities this company needs to move forward. His vision, his charisma, I believe he's the right man for the job. Leadership qualities? Vision? Charisma? This was the same guy who had barely shown up to work in years, the guy whose only real contribution to the company was running up the entertainment budget. I wanted to argue, to defend everything I had done for the company, but before I could speak, Ryan stood up, holding a folder in his hand. I'd like to take a moment to address something important, he said, his tone formal and measured, which only made the whole thing more surreal. He opened the folder and began flipping through pages, pausing dramatically as if he were about to reveal some groundbreaking discovery. Over the past few months, Ryan began, I've come across some troubling discrepancies in the way certain decisions have been made. He looked directly at me as he said it. It appears that Ethan has been operating outside his authority, Ryan continued. There have been unapproved deals, questionable financial decisions, and actions that could compromise the company's reputation. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. None of it was true, of course, but Ryan had framed it all so carefully. Just vague enough to sound plausible, just detailed enough to make me look reckless. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but Dad raised a hand to stop me. Let him finish, he said, his tone calm but firm. Ryan went on to present his evidence, which was little more than a collection of half-truths and misrepresentations. He painted me as some power-hungry executive who had overstepped my bounds and put the company at risk. By the time he was done, I could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room on me. I only bring this up because I care deeply about the company's future, Ryan said, his voice dripping with insincerity. We need to maintain the highest level of integrity in all aspects of our operations. The irony was almost too much to bear. Ryan, talking about integrity. When he finished, the room fell silent. All eyes turned to Dad. He let out a long sigh, as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders, then looked directly at me. After reviewing the situation, he said, I've decided to terminate Ethan's employment effective immediately. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Security guards appeared seemingly out of nowhere, standing by the doors as if waiting to escort me out. I stood up slowly, my mind racing. There was so much I wanted to say, so many arguments I wanted to make, but I knew it was pointless. This wasn't a decision that had been made in the boardroom today. It had been decided long before I walked in. As I gathered my belongings, Ryan leaned over and whispered just loud enough for me to hear. Nothing personal, little brother. Just business. I looked at him, his smug grin, his feigned innocence, and I realized what this was really about. It wasn't about the company's future. It was about Ryan proving something. To me, to Dad, to anyone who had ever compared the two of us. He didn't care about the business. He cared about taking it from me. I walked out of that boardroom with as much dignity as I could muster, but inside, I was seething. Years of hard work, sleepless nights, and personal sacrifice. All of it had been turned against me. Ryan had stolen my job, my reputation, and the narrative of everything I'd accomplished. By the time I reached my car, my phone was already buzzing with messages from coworkers, friends, and even a few board members who were shocked by what had happened. I ignored them all. I needed time to think. The drive home was a blur. I kept replaying the meeting in my head, trying to figure out how I had missed the signs. Looking back, they were all there. Ryan's sudden interest in the company, Dad's cryptic remarks about leadership, the distant behavior of some board members. I had been so focused on running the company that I hadn't seen the storm brewing right under my nose. When I got home, I sat in the dark for hours, trying to make sense of it all. How could Dad, the man who had watched me pour my heart and soul into saving the company, choose Ryan? Was it blind loyalty? Favoritism? Or was I just that easy to replace in his eyes? Whatever the reason, one thing was clear. I was out and Ryan was in. But as angry and betrayed as I felt, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going down without a fight. I didn't have a plan yet, but I had something far more valuable, the truth. Ryan thought he had one, but he didn't realize I wasn't leaving empty-handed. Far from it. The morning after that humiliating meeting, I woke up early, determined not to let Ryan's betrayal destroy me. As I sat in my home office nursing a bitter cup of coffee, my thoughts became clear. I had spent years building Carter Holdings back from the brink, and Ryan had done nothing but undermine my efforts. He might have taken my position, but he didn't understand what really held the company together. That was my advantage. See, while I'd been saving the company, I'd also been preparing for the worst. I had suspected for a long time that Ryan, or even Dad, might pull something like this. The favoritism had always been clear. I didn't know the exact shape the betrayal would take, but I wasn't naive enough to think my hard work alone would shield me. So, I had quietly built a safety net. Over the years, I'd set up a separate business. On paper, it was a small support company designed to streamline operations at Carter Holdings. In reality, it held the company's most valuable assets, intellectual property, key client contracts, and proprietary systems. Everything the company needed to function was housed there, and I owned it outright. That morning, I made my first moves. I called a handful of employees who had been with me since the darkest days. People I trusted, people who knew what I was capable of. They weren't high-profile executives. They were the backbone of the company. Senior developers, IT specialists, and 2 key managers. I didn't explain everything. I didn't need to. All I said was, trust me. Don't make any major decisions until you hear from me. Every single one of them agreed. That told me all I needed to know about where their loyalty lay. Next, I sifted through years of documents, contracts, and correspondence. I wasn't just looking for mistakes. I was gathering evidence. I knew Ryan too well to believe he was clean. For years, he'd been reckless, selfish, and careless. Somewhere in the mess of records, I knew there'd be proof of his mismanagement. Something I could use to show everyone what kind of leader he really was. It didn't take long to find it. Ryan had been making shady deals for years, side agreements with competitors, inflated vendor contracts, and personal expenses disguised as company costs. It wasn't just bad management. Some of it bordered on fraud. By the time I finished compiling the evidence, I had a folder thick enough to bring down an empire. But bringing Ryan down wasn't my goal, not entirely. The following Monday, I logged into Carter Holdings Network from my home office. Yes, I still had access. Ryan, for all his talk about leadership and vision, hadn't thought to revoke my credentials. That was his first mistake. I activated a small fail-safe I'd programmed into the system years ago. It wasn't malicious, no viruses, no damage. It simply redirected all internal communications, emails, memos, meeting invites, to a secure server I controlled. From that point on, I knew everything happening within the company. Then I turned my attention to Ryan's office computer. He hadn't even changed his password. It was the same one he'd been using since college. I uploaded a video file to his desktop and set it to play automatically when he logged in. The file was simple, a highlight reel of his worst decisions, complete with timestamps and supporting documentation. The next morning, I sat at my desk with my coffee, watching the chaos unfold. Ryan walked into the office, late as usual, looking smug as ever. Through the security feed, I watched him sit at the CEO's desk, lean back in his chair, and turn on his computer. A second later, the video began to play. At first, he looked confused. Then his face turned red. He banged on the keyboard, trying to close the file, but it wouldn't stop. Every screen in his office was showing the same video, looping over and over. That was just the beginning. At the same time, emails started flooding the inboxes of board members, department heads, and key investors. Each email contained a piece of evidence I had gathered, proof of Ryan's mismanagement, reckless spending, and questionable dealings. I kept the tone professional, avoiding personal attacks. The facts spoke for themselves. While Ryan was scrambling to contain the damage, federal agents entered the building. I had tipped off the authorities about some of Ryan's more dubious financial practices. They were ready to have a little chat with him. Then came the final blow. The IT department, loyal to me, sent out a mass email announcing their resignation. Every single one of them had already signed contracts with my new company, the subsidiary I'd established to hold Carter Holdings' most valuable assets. Their email ended with a simple statement. We stand with the person who built this company. Ryan tried to call IT for help, but no one answered. He called Dad, but Dad didn't pick up. He even tried calling me, but I let it go to voicemail. By mid-morning, the board had called an emergency meeting. Through the security feed, I watched Ryan shuffle into the boardroom, looking pale and disheveled. I couldn't hear what was said, but I didn't need to. From the expressions on the board members' faces, it was clear Ryan's charm wasn't going to save him this time. By noon, Ryan was escorted out of the building. I wasn't smug or vindictive as I watched it happen. If anything, I felt a strange sense of calm. This wasn't about revenge. It was about setting things right. News of the chaos spread quickly. By the end of the day, the company was in free fall. The stock price plummeted, lawsuits started piling up, and investors fled. Without the key assets housed in my subsidiary, Carter Holdings was little more than an empty shell. That evening, I sent an email to every employee who had stayed behind, offering them a chance to join my new company. The email was simple. To everyone who has worked tirelessly for Carter Holdings, I want you to know your efforts haven't gone unnoticed. I'm building something new, something better, and I'd like you to be part of it. Your jobs and benefits will remain secure, with more opportunities for growth. There's no pressure, this is your choice. Thank you for everything you've done. You deserve better. Ethan Carter. Within hours, my inbox was flooded with responses. More than 90% of the staff accepted my offer immediately. Meanwhile, Ryan's troubles were just beginning. The investigation into his financial misconduct quickly went public, and the media had a field day. Stories of his reckless spending and shady deals dominated headlines, painting him as the poster child for nepotism gone wrong. Dad, for his part, went silent. I imagine he was trying to process how everything had fallen apart so quickly. But by the time he realized the damage Ryan had done, it was too late. The company was finished. As for me, I was just getting started. The first few weeks after leaving Carter Holdings were chaotic, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was in control. The new company I'd built, Apex Solutions, wasn't just a continuation of the old one. It was a transformation. It was built on everything I had learned during my years at Carter Holdings: honesty, transparency, and valuing the people who made the company work. Our transition wasn't without challenges. Legal battles emerged almost immediately. Ryan, Dad, and even some board members tried to claim ownership of the assets I transferred to Apex Solutions. But everything had been done by the book. I'd spent years quietly laying the groundwork, making sure the contracts and structures were airtight. When the dust settled, the courts ruled in my favor. Clients and employees had followed me for one reason: trust. They knew who had built the original company into something successful, and they believed in my vision for the future. By the end of the first quarter, Apex Solutions was not just stable, it was growing. We launched a new product line within months, a platform designed to streamline logistics for small and mid-sized businesses. It took off faster than I'd anticipated. The buzz in the industry wasn't just about the product, it was about us. Apex Solutions quickly earned a reputation as a company that innovated, delivered, and valued its people. Meanwhile, Carter Holdings was falling apart. The lawsuits, the loss of key assets, and Ryan's scandal made the company a pariah in the industry. Investors bailed, employees fled, and what was left was little more than a hollow shell. Ryan's name became synonymous with corporate incompetence, a cautionary tale told in business schools and industry seminars. Dad eventually reached out. He and my mom, Marilyn, came to my new office one morning. It had been months since I'd seen them, and the weight of the situation was etched into their faces. "We need to talk," Dad said, his voice quiet but firm. I listened as he admitted that they were struggling. With their savings tied up in Carter Holdings stock, they were on the brink of losing everything: their home, their retirement, their stability. He didn't apologize for what had happened, but I could tell he regretted it. "You made your choice, Dad," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You chose Ryan. You let him destroy everything we worked for." "I didn't know it would turn out like this," he said, sounding more defeated than I'd ever heard him. "I was wrong, Ethan. I see that now." In that moment, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. The resentment I'd carried for so long wasn't worth holding on to. But forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. "I'll help you," I said finally, "but on my terms." The terms were simple. I would buy their shares in Carter Holdings at their original value, ensuring they could retire comfortably. In exchange, they had to agree to retire quietly, sign a non-disclosure agreement, and let me handle things from here. They reluctantly agreed, and the papers were signed within days. With that chapter closed, I focused entirely on Apex Solutions. By the end of the first year, we had surpassed every goal I'd set. Revenue was higher than I'd projected, client retention was at an all-time high, and employees were thriving in an environment built on respect and collaboration. The most rewarding moments weren't the headlines or accolades. It was the simple, everyday things. Seeing employees excited about their work, hearing clients talk about how we'd helped their businesses grow, and knowing that I'd built something meaningful. 3 years have passed since the fallout, and Apex Solutions is thriving. We're considered the gold standard in the industry, a company others look to as a model of how to do things right. As for Ryan, I don't hear much about him anymore. Last I heard, he was working a low-level job somewhere, trying to avoid the spotlight. His name still pops up in business articles occasionally, but only as a cautionary tale. Dad and I have remained distant. He's never fully repaired the damage he caused, and I don't think he knows how. Mom sends me updates from time to time, neighborhood potlucks, quiet vacations, but I've kept my boundaries. Looking back, I've realized something important. I don't need their approval. I never did. Success isn't about proving people wrong. It's about building something real, something lasting, and knowing your worth even when others don't. While others played politics and fought for titles, I focused on the work. While Ryan basked in the spotlight, I built the foundation. That's why Apex Solutions stands tall today, and why Carter Holdings is nothing more than a memory. This isn't the end of my story. It's just the beginning. I've learned that true success isn't about revenge or recognition. It's about resilience, strategy, and staying true to your vision, no matter how many times life tries to knock you down.